Our next speaker is Madison Churchill. Yes. Madison is a diver and an artist from Washington State. Madison is extremely modest, I would say, but I would say she's an incredibly talented artist, and I'm really excited for you to see what she has to share with you today. Madison has a deep interest in kelp forest conservation, loves everything seaweed, and is passionate about science communication and teaching others about ocean ecosystems. So Madison really came in with a passion for seaweed, for science, for diving, for art. And so really it was taking all of these areas where she was already great and knew and had a lot of experience and a lot of skill, and just finding new ways for her to marry them together and develop them during her time with the program. So it feels like it was such a good fit, and really is such a joy to have you here and watch your journey developing this presentation in particular. So the name of her presentation is Exploring Seaweed Biodiversity Through Art Science, an illustrated guide to marine algae of Southern California. Welcome, Madison.
Thank you. As an avid scuba diver, I have a deep interest and fascination with the species that I encounter underwater. I find that the more I learn about a certain species, the more I begin to care about it and understand its role in its ecosystem. One thing that has always helped me to learn and memorize different species is to paint them. As Samantha mentioned, I have a deep fascination with seaweed in particular. Diving on the West Coast for many years, I have had the opportunity to see the amazing, amazing seaweed beds, kelp forests, the awesome biodiversity that it has out here, the habitat it creates, it's all around awesome. So when I moved to California from Washington, I did the first thing I do anywhere I visit. I started looking for field guides to help me learn about my local biodiversity. In my search for field guides about local seaweeds, my search ran up short. Many of the existing resources that I found about our local seaweeds were either not region specific, many of them were a bit outdated, some of them lacked colored pictures, which if you've ever tried IDing a seaweed without a picture, it is quite hard. And a commonality through most of them was that a lot of them were highly scientific, contained a lot of jargon, and were not fit for the average naturalist like myself. So I decided to create my own. For my project, I illustrated and designed a field guide of Southern California seaweeds. I created a complete book draft with around 100 hand-painted scientific illustrations of seaweeds. These scientific illustrations are painted in a way to highlight specific features that someone could use if they were trying to identify a species in the tide pools or out in the wild. There are thought to be over 700 species of seaweed just in California alone. So I chose to stick to the most common ones and the ones that could be identified without a microscope and without any kind of equipment. The audience for this book is folks like myself and probably many of you in this room, recreational naturalists, divers, snorkelers, beachcombers, tide poolers, anyone who is just curious about learning about the natural world around them. I wanted to create a resource that was really accessible and easy to understand for non-scientists, which isn't to say that scientists couldn't enjoy this resource as well. To do this, I have broken down some of the complex themes of seaweed ecology, and I've used language that the average person would be able to understand. I have limited the kind of more, jargon words, for lack of a better term, to just the really important concepts, and I have defined them throughout the text. I really didn't want the science to be a barrier, but rather an opportunity for someone to learn more about this amazing resource that we have. So I'd love to show you all some of the mock pages in my book. These are shown in spreads of 2 pages, as if you were opening a book with a seam down the middle. At the beginning, I have some introductory pages to create a base knowledge for if you are not already a seaweed ecologist. These particular introductory pages include different types of branching patterns that we see in seaweeds, different holdfast types, which is how a seaweed attaches itself to its substrate. And I've also included some keywords for describing different types of morphology and shapes of seaweed. And most of these words come up throughout the rest of the text as I am giving visual descriptions of the seaweeds. On a similar note, I have also added a diagram of the anatomy of kelp. The words that we use to describe the different parts of seaweed and kelp are different from what you have probably seen on land plants. They don't have things like roots, stems, leaves, so I've included those terms up front as well. Now going into some of my sample pages. So my finished draft is about 100 pages, so I'm just sticking to showing you a handful of my favorites. These are organized by genus with some species representatives of each. And you can see just within the Chondrochanthus genus here, we have a few very different looking species. So I really wanted to show some of the biodiversity there. Chondrochanthus exasperatus, or Turkish towel, that's the one on the left, the tallest one, is one of my very favorite seaweeds. It's this beautiful dark crimson red color, and it has a really rough texture like a towel. That's how it has its common name, Turkish towel. All of my pages include some key information, including the genus and species name, the taxonomy, the range, where you would find it out in the wild, and then a visual description. This one, since I mentioned it has that interesting texture, I've added a zoom bubble to kind of give you a closer look. Codium, or dead man's fingers, is another one of my favorites. This is a green seaweed you can find locally. It is unicellular, meaning the entire seaweed is just one giant cell, and it has free-floating nucleuses and chloroplasts throughout it. I find that really interesting. This seaweed has a little friend, sea slug, that has adapted to suck out its chloroplasts and incorporate them in its own cells so that the sea slug can now photosynthesize like a plant. I find that super interesting, and I have added a handful of these little invertebrate guest stars throughout the book. Macrocystis, or giant kelp, is one that many of you have probably seen here locally, either washed up on the beach or skimming the surface. It's a really, really important species. This is where we get our big kelp forests, these amazing three-dimensional habitats. They provide shelter and food to a number of different important species. This one had an interesting growth form. At the very top, it has what we call a scimitar blade. This is where it's growing and splitting off its new blades. So I have included a zoom into that. And I've also included its relationship with purple urchins as well, another one of our little invertebrate mentions. Sargassum, also known as devilweed or wireweed, is a fairly common non-native species here. It is pretty invasive and has the potential to outcompete native species. I've included quite a few non-native and invasive species throughout this book because I wanted it to really reflect things that you are going to see out here locally. For this one, this features two different species of sargassum, Horneri and Muticum, and they look visually pretty similar. So this is another one where I've added these zoom bubbles to kind of give you a closer look, and I've included its juvenile form as well. So a little bit about the methods for creating this book. Curating my list of seaweeds was by far the hardest part, or really knowing when to stop adding seaweeds was the hardest part. As I mentioned, over 700 species in California, and I wanted to stick to the most common ones to make this a really succinct and effective resource. I started with species that I was physically seeing often out while I was diving, doing surveys, tide pooling. I included a lot of species we studied in Dr. Jen Smith's phycology class, and I spent a lot of time on iNaturalist looking at common local hits that people were seeing out here. And for those who might not know, iNaturalist is a really amazing resource where people add their observations from the wild, and it builds this really helpful database. Many of these species, I collected live specimens. This was preferable whenever possible. I suspended them in salt water to have right at my desk to use as reference to paint from. This was a preferred method because I really wanted to capture the way that they're moving in water. A lot of seaweeds look different once you take them out of the water. For some with more complicated branching patterns, it was really helpful to press and dry them so I can really study that. And additionally, I took hundreds and hundreds of pictures of seaweed out in the wild, particularly helpful for things like these two on the bottom, which have iridescence. That blue one, once you take it out, it just turns brown. So pictures were helpful for that as well. Here is an example of one of my species that I found here. This was a really exciting find. These are sea grapes. I was out diving with a member of my cohort, and I just happened to be in the right position to see them under a rock overhang, and I was so excited. I think I talked about them all day. So I took them home, I pressed them to preserve the specimen, and I created my watercolor painting. Once I did all of my illustrations, I digitized them all using Adobe Suite, which was a really cool and new resource for me that I hadn't used very much. So I would say I definitely achieved my goal of learning about my local seaweeds, potentially maybe even a little too much, although I don't think that's possible. I now have plans to continue exploring seaweed biodiversity up the West Coast. Now that I have a completed book draft, I intend to submit it for publication over the next year, so that others can use this as a resource as well. I have learned so much about seaweed and its amazing biodiversity, all the incredible things it does for our planet. I've just learned so much about it throughout this project, and hopefully with this book, you all can too. I just wanted to give a special thank you to my capstone committee, Dr. Jen Smith, Josie Eisland, and Andrea Dingledine, as well as all of my amazing test readers who have left me really valuable feedback throughout this. And thank you to my cohort who have been really supportive, and my friends and family. And I have a QR code where you can scan to sign up for an email list for updates as I plan to get this published. Thank you.
Great presentation, Madison. I've got a question. For someone who doesn't know very much about seaweed at all, what would you hope that they might learn from this book?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would really hope that someone who has maybe never thought about seaweed beyond it's just like the stinky stuff on the beach, I would hope for someone to see that, the seaweed is an incredible resource. There's so many different species, so many unique, special, different kinds. They create habitat, they provide food, they support so many different other species. And if nothing else, I would hope to just spark a little curiosity if it's something you've never thought of before.
Well, first of all, these are beautiful pieces, but I was just wondering, why in particular did you decide to use watercolors?
Yeah, thank you for asking. Well, first I'll just say I went the route of scientific illustration rather than, say, something like photography, because I really like the flexibility and creativity that allows me to, say, emphasize specific features. Watercolor is just, that's my skill set. And I really like that I'm able to kind of get precise detail in it. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Yeah.
We've got one here too. I have a question. What do you think sparked the interest? This is amazing work, and it's something that will definitely get people involved with macroalgae. What do you think sparked your interest in the first place?
That's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think I've just always been fascinated. I mean, I've always been a plant person and I love the ocean. And so this was just like a nice little connection. I would say I started really thinking about seaweed. I'm from Washington and I scuba dive a lot up there. And a lot of the sites that I go to frequently have these amazing seasonal seaweed beds where like you look down at a certain time of year and it's just a rainbow of like all these different colors, different textures. And the artistic part of my brain just really loves that. Yeah, I don't know. And the more I learn about it, the more I want to learn about it. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Again, just remarkable work.
Thank you so much.
It strikes me that the word seaweed just doesn't do justice. Is
agree.
there another word that you would think of in describing this just incredible biodiversity other than seaweed, which seems so pedestrian?
That's a really good question. I might have to think on that and come back to you. I want to say algae, but I'm not sure that does it more or less justice. Sea plants, marine flora. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Madison.